Good evening, film fans from near and far. It is so good to be back together again. My name is Jacob Mazer. I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I want to welcome you to our Monday night film discussion. We took the summer off, but now we're back, and we are going to continue to hold these discussions on the second Monday of every month at 7 o'clock p.m. And what a great film we have to kick off this new season. Fritz Lang's The Big Heat, a gritty tale of crime and corruption and revenge, released in 1953, right at the heart of the classic noir period. And here to discuss the film with me is BMFI faculty member Lisa DeNight. Lisa, how are you this evening?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Jacob?
Doing okay. Can't wait to get into discussing this film. Before we dive in, though, let me just say a couple words about how to participate in this discussion. Please do keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question. When you are called on, that's a great time to unmute yourself and to share your question or your comments. And once you've shared your remarks, please do mute your audio once again. Now, how do I signal that I'd like to be called on, you might be asking yourself. And that is easy enough. Please just use the raise hand icon, which you can see marked under the number 2 bubble at the bottom of this slide. You can also type your thoughts into the chat, and the icon is there at the bottom of the slide as well. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and as questions and other subjects bubble up, we'll do our best to bring those into the discussion. Furthermore, if you are joining us at one of these film discussions for the first time, I do encourage you to use that chat to introduce yourself and let us know from where you're joining us. So let's get into it, shall we? I think we have some hands already. So first up, we have the Glussmans. David and Janice Glussman, please unmute yourself. I'm excited.
I am unmuted. The picture is Janice having a nice drink, but it is me mostly doing the talking tonight. Thrilled to be back together with the two of you. Lisa, I think you indicated at some point in your introduction how special this movie was. And I will tell you both and the audience, in addition to enjoying watching it, I got to enjoy it more preparing some thoughts and comments and going through some of the reviews at the time. A couple of questions I'm going to throw in for the two of you. The body count that Lisa started to talk about toward the end of her introduction, 4 women at the end. And I have to give a quick accolade to my late father-in-law, who went through some of these movies. And his joke always was, everybody was dead but the ushers. And well, almost all the women died in this movie if they showed up. One of the questions I had is, why did Debbie get taken to Banyan's room in the first place? Was he really looking for sex? Was he looking for information? And I sort of felt like we were setting up when she got to the room, and I never quite got my own fulfillment of that answer. Some of the information sort of gets intertwined with this stuff. Does he tell Debbie some of the information about Bertha because he wants her to kill Bertha? Or is it just information he's passing along? They weave this really, really well. And you sort of have a lot of buildup. And then when Lee Marvin really gets into his part the first time, the whole thing, I think, just really takes off. He's listed as a star, but he's not, as a secondary star at that point in his career, but he's not really yet the star. But boy, is this a Lee Marvin performance. And I agree with the comment. Gloria Graham just absolutely blows everybody away to my view. I didn't realize until afterwards that she's the Can't Say No girl from Oklahoma. And looking at those 2 separate pictures, it's 2 different actresses. And that really says a lot for how well she can act. So I hope I set you up with a little bit. The thanks for getting us all back together for sure. And take it away.
Well, thanks for your comments, David. You brought some good points to the table. First off, raising the subject about the role of women, the role and the part of violence against women in the film and the toll that women pay for their participation in this whole scheme. You've also raised a very interesting question about the strange scene where Gloria Graham's Debbie goes to the hotel room of Dave Banyan, who's then sort of fairly newly embarked on his revenge spree. And it seems like there's going to be some kind of assignation, although it doesn't turn out that way. Very pertinent questions to bring to the table. Lisa, do you want to start by speaking to any of those?
Sure. David, thank you so much for your comments. It's so nice to be back and hearing from faves new and old. I love that scene in the bar because that leads to the hotel scene, because you get the idea that both of these people, Banyan and Debbie, are going to use each other. and that is the theme of that scene in the hotel room. Debbie, I characterize her as bored. She is bored with her fancy life. She kind of doesn't like Vince, but he provides her with expensive clothes, expensive fun. As she says, she's been rich and poor. Believe me, rich is better. She's bored. She doesn't like Vince very much. He just burned a woman's hand. And here's this man who is standing up to him. And there's this shot of her in the bar where her eyes just kind of alight. And to me, she follows him out because she is bored and she dislikes Vince, and she just wants to get one over on him on the sly even. She is looking to actually seduce him in my estimation because of the reasons I laid out. Banyan is initially disgusted by her. He wouldn't touch anything of Vince Stone's with a 10-foot pole, but he also quickly realizes that he can use her, and it's for information about the sordid underbelly. The one thing that is interesting about this pairing is I feel like in a lot of other film noirs there would be an assignation, there would be some sort of a sexual affair, or perhaps even a sexual redemption, an affair that leads to redemption for both Debbie and potentially Banyan. And that doesn't happen here. It really is these two people using each other, and one decides to take a different tact with the rest of their short life, and the other doesn't. And I'll leave it at there, and we can kind of expand on that comment later, but I'll pass it back to you, Jacob.
Yeah, I think that's good stuff, Lisa. I'll just add a couple things onto it. I mean, so one thing that brings to mind for me is the way that sex and sexuality sort of functions in the whole scheme of things as a tool, as something that the characters can use to further their goals. In many cases, we see characters, alive and dead, male and female, striving towards a higher social station. There's a sort of class dynamic and a class ascension dynamic. Certainly the case with Gloria Graham's Debbie. As you said, Lisa, I've been rich and I've been poor, and being rich is better, she says. And sex is a tool that she, and sexual appeal is a tool that she knows that she has at her disposal, that she uses as she, in her endeavors. And I think that functions into some of the developments with her character later on in the film. Perhaps we'll come to that. The question of Banyan is interesting too. This is a character that we follow on a fairly typical noirish journey in certain ways, from the up and up part of society into a kind of underworld, both in the sense where he's sort of exploring the literal criminal world in the film, but also into a kind of moral underworld. This is after he's been sort of cut loose from his family ties and his sort of stable station in a very kind of Eisenhower-y, wholesome American family unit. You know, so although he doesn't opt to, you know, to link up with Debbie, it's hard for me to imagine that that's a possibility that he's not at least considering on some level, or an idea that he's exploring at least on some level, because this seems to be, I read it at least as a exploration that he's going through in certain ways of urges that have kind of been under the surface and have been checked. And I think this theme too continues through the character's journey in the film. Let's move on to the next comment, which is Jonathan Gelfand. Jonathan, can you please unmute yourself? And we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Hi. And I have formerly been labeled here as Joss, which I continue to be.
Ah, Joss.
So nice to be back. First, a couple of comments. First, something that's of no particular importance, a bit of trivia that struck me. The scene where Banyan goes to the retreat, well into the movie, looking for Larry, whose last name is a mystery to him, and he's trying to find out who Larry is. And he does not succeed at that visit. He learns who Larry is sometime later, and again, and manipulates his death. But what I'm getting at here is totally irrelevant. The band in the bar is playing a tune, which is Put the Blame on Mame, which was a somewhat iconic near striptease done by Rita Hayworth in the film Gilda, where the protagonist is just taken by this performance, and it happens to be Glenn Ford in the film several years earlier than this. And I wasn't thinking about it. I said, I know this tune. Oh my gosh. It's Put the Blame on Mame from Gilda, and Glenn Ford was in that movie. I don't know if that was intentional or coincidental, but it made me laugh. So I thought I'd just mention it. If anybody wants to go look at it, it was around minute 55 into the movie. More importantly, this was a wonderful movie. It was tight, it was efficient. The dialogue was wonderful, especially the two main characters, and most especially Gloria Graham, as you've said. I want to echo what's already been discussed, which was all the dead women. And, you know, the sort of archetypal film noir is this sort of upstanding guy who gets involved with a femme fatale and gets sucked into an underworld, as you said, Jacob. And that didn't strike me as what happens here. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of films like Double Indemnity, or even more recently, Body Heat. The femme fatale is completely cognizant of what's going on and manipulates everything. And that's not what was going on here. I mean, yes, Debbie and Banyan were using each other, but it seemed to me that the real fatal character is Banyan. Right from the beginning, he hears from Lucy that the cop who kills himself at the beginning was having an affair of sorts with her, and that he wasn't depressed, and that he wasn't unhappy, and that his suicide didn't make sense. And he immediately goes back to the guy's wife and tells her about it. And at this point, we already know that she's corrupt because she hides the letter. And lo and behold, Lucy ends up dead. His wife's death was a sort of unfortunate coincidence, although you saw it coming when she asked for the keys and she was going to go pick up the babysitter instead of him. And just at that point, I said, oh my God, the car's going to blow up. And that's another trope that's been used again. It was used very prominently in The Godfather, when Michael Corleone is in Sicily and his young wife gets blown up in the car when that explosion was intended for him. We've already discussed the death of the cop's wife and how he sets Debbie up to do it. And I think he knew what he was doing. And that gets me to Debbie's death. And I don't think he intended that to happen necessarily, but I wonder, was the Haze office still active in 1953? And did that require Debbie to pay for her crime of killing someone else? And I wonder if they had to manipulate the plot to get to that point. Anyway, with all of that in mind, there wasn't really a femme fatale. He was the fatalist. He was the fatal character, almost an fatale. And you know, he gets out of it almost unscathed. He goes back to his job and has earned the respect of everyone in the police station, and he just goes on with his life, which, you know, may happen with a femme fatale in other stories. Anyway, any other thoughts about all that?
Well, you've certainly put a lot on the table to talk about, Joss. Good stuff. I'm glad we're going to talk more about women in the film, the role of women in the film, and also the relationship of Debbie to the sort of noir femme fatale archetype. First, let me just touch briefly on your question about the Haze Code, which was the production code that was in effect in Hollywood that required certain content censorship on the part of the studios in order to at least socially present as an acceptable film. The Haze Code was in effect. In fact, the Haze Code was in effect until I think 1967 or 1968. However, this is a very interesting period in Hollywood history because this is 1953, and this is a period where the authority of the Haze Code is starting to weaken. We are starting to see during this period a number of films that sort of push the boundaries of the kind of content that can appear in a film and with which a film can still draw an audience, be commercially successful, get critical accolades, and so forth. So some other films of the same general period that would fall in line with kind of that same movement of pushing at the Haze Code. You could think of A Streetcar Named Desire. You could think of Some Like It Hot a few years later, Anatomy of a Murder, Psycho in 1960. So, you know, I think the depictions of violence in the film are fairly shocking for something that came out in the early 50s. But this is a trend that we're seeing in Hollywood at the time. The Haze Code did require, or one of its provisions was that characters who did wrong were to be punished in the end, very moralistic. I know that in the novel from which the film is adapted, Debbie does die. So it's in the source too. That was not a plot contrivance that was foisted on them by the board. Although I think she commits suicide in the novel, whereas here she gets a different kind of death. So Lisa, I'm going to kick it to you to talk about the femme fatale and anything else you'd like to pick up on from Joss.
Yeah, Josh, that was a whole bunch of good stuff. Thank you. That was really great. And to just kind of continue on from Jacob, yes, Debbie did die in the book as well, as Jacob described. I will note, in the original scenario written by Sidney Baum for The Big Heat as an adaptation from the book, the ending was actually much happier. It was so Debbie actually survived and went to the hospital, and the final shot was supposed to be Banyan leaving to go get breakfast with his daughter, and Fritz Lang actually thought that did not suit his purpose, which it didn't. And I think, Josh, you really got at this idea that Banyan is this homme fatale, but he gets off kind of scot-free from having this wake of bodies in his tow, and the ending that Lang devised of that precinct setting where he is back on the job, he has the respect of everyone around him, he's off on another case. That ending, and to connect to something you also said, Joss, how intentional and deliberate everything about this movie is, to the point where I'm certain, I don't know this for sure, but I'm intuitively certain that song choice in the bar was chosen on purpose. Everything about this is so deeply calculated and considered and intentional, and the fact that Lang ends the movie with Banyan saying, "Keep the coffee hot," or however he puts that, like, make sure the coffee's hot, as he's like running out to get on a case. Man, every time I see this movie, it is so appalling to me. Like, I truly hate Banyan in that moment, because what a disgustingly callous thing to say, considering the way coffee has been used in this film, and it is recent past. And I have like problems drinking coffee after I see this movie, but it is deliberately chosen on Lang's part to make us all walk away with this unsettled, fraught sense that this is not a resolved issue. This is not a movie where a good man has been reintegrated into society and succeed. It is much more complex and darker than that. And the fact that you kind of elucidated every single one of the women characters that ended up dead in this film, that is so purposeful in this movie too. Like, Lang is really impressing upon us the weight of every single one of those deaths that Banyan either indirectly or directly had bearing on. And I think it is a marvelously progressive movie for a movie where so many female bodies do pile up. I think it is a remarkably progressive movie when you think about what the director is trying to say about women's roles in a patriarchal society. Well, I'll pass it back to you, Jacob.
I think you're right on point, Lisa. I mean, it's funny because in certain ways, Banyan, a sort of myopic way to view the film would be that, wholesome hero experiences brutal tragedy, flirts with the prospect of doing wrong, but ultimately his moral urges win out at the end, and he chooses not to kill Vince Stone and to arrest him in the name of justice and to return to the force and all that. returning to the embrace of wholesome society and stable social order and all that. But there's this wreckage in the background that it sort of coasts over, and I think that Long wants us to trip on a little bit. I'm so struck by the scene at the end of the movie where, once the gunfight is done and once Vince is being apprehended, there's a part where Banyan walks away from Gloria Graham on the floor to give the cops who are cuffing Vince, to say like cuff him tighter or something that is not that important. And meanwhile, she's dying on the ground, and then she gets this sort of dramatic Hollywood death where we get a nice soft focus shot of her perishing beautifully while he talks to her tearfully. But what's he talking about? He's reminiscing about his own wife. He's not, it doesn't seem particularly focused on her. I mean, it's a weird thing to talk about to somebody who is who's dying right before you. It seems in a certain way that he's not totally grasping the entire gravity of the situation and his place in it. And I think that is reason for us to be a little bit skeptical about the so-called return to order. We have some more hands up. Before we go any further, I want to read a comment that we got through written in, which is from Rich, who writes, "I am intrigued by the tension between the grittiness and overt/implicit violence of the movie and the mythology of the 1950s of the bucolic suburb and happy life of the American family. Think Ozzie and Harriet, Life with Father, Leave It to Beaver, etc. Some of those were 1960s series, but the point remains about what we wanted to believe on the surface of American society and what was in its underbelly. Of course, throughout the 1950s and beyond was also the deep psychological fear of nuclear holocaust." So Rich brings to us this question about the 1950s domestic unit, the bucolic suburban happy family life, and the darker things underneath. Lisa, do you have any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think a big theme of this film is the tension between nice surfaces, respectable surfaces, and the hidden corruption underneath. And the most powerful visual of that, I think, is when we do get that empty version of Banyan's house. Let me back up a minute. I actually think that Long is approving of the wholesome suburban family, and I've had to kind of tussle with that over the viewings of this, because it doesn't necessarily seem particularly Longian to me. But those scenes with Katie and the child whose name I don't remember at the moment, and Banyan, are so warm. There's actually, in such a tight movie, there's actually a fair number of minutes devoted to establishing this very, I would say, rather egalitarian relationship. I mean, they're setting the table together, etc. Relatively speaking. And I genuinely do think that Long is not completely gutting the whole concept of wholesome 50s values. I really don't. But I do think, especially with that visual of the empty house and what we know about Banyan at that point, I think the true theme to come out of this is that everyone, in 1953 or at any time, has the capacity to truly cross a line that perhaps they didn't know they could. And I think that is not refuting 50s values. it's just showing what is lying in wait if the right set of circumstances reveal themselves.
It's well said, and the point I think is underscored a little bit by these sort of, parallel sort of domestic scenes, I think, that we see between Banyan's home life and the big bad Mike Logano's life. We get to go inside Mike Logano's house, and we learn that he has a framed portrait of his mother who he's taken care of for his whole life. Logano is upset to have his work life intruding on his home life, as is Banyan. We learned that Logano too is a contributor to various, social causes and, civic efforts. So, it's not to suggest necessarily a parallel between the two characters, but I think there is this sort of distorted reflection that Long is setting up in a way. Let me also say, it's pulling the camera back a little bit, as it were. It's, film noir being a cycle, a sort of form, a genre, whatever you want to call it, that is so interested in the darker underbelly, the impulses beneath the surface, the ugly pieces of the human experience that can't quite stay hidden, can't quite stay underneath. It makes sense that this is a form that really flourished in the post-war period. I think this is a subject that we see in, culture grappling with in all sorts of art from the period in the 50s. This kind of attempt at what is normality like in after the period that we've all been through. You have a generation that's, seen Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and, now are supposed to get a house in a cul-de-sac and like go to Rotary Club meetings or whatever. How well does that work out? What's underneath? So, film noir, the cycle people usually mark at the beginning of the 40s and really coming to its peak, I think, in the early 50s and going through about 1958 with Touch of Evil. So, this is there is some zeitgeist in here, I think. Let's go to our next hand, which is Robert Gidding. Robert, can you please unmute yourself? We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thanks. We studied Fritz Lang last year with Lisa, and I'm trying to put this, I think we studied with Lisa, Scarlet Street, and we studied M, and I think we might have done Metropolis. So I'm trying to put this film in context with the others. And what I noticed was I was looking for cinematography. That's sort of my pet interest. And I didn't see the creativity in cinematography in this film that I saw in M, for example. Nor did I see the creativity in this film that I saw in Scarlet Street. And now I am perfectly delighted to be corrected on this. I did not see some of the characteristics that we learned from Lisa about cinematography in noir, which is attention to architecture, which there is none in this picture, whereas if you look at The Third Man, which is a great film noir, there's attention to architecture and a city, structures. I don't see any of that in this picture. I didn't see any creative camera angles in this picture, but I'm delighted to be corrected. I noted that all the filming locations were inside. in the interior of the apartment of Banyan, Lagana's house, the police station, the bar. And then there was the apartment of his army friend. I didn't see hardly any exterior shots. I didn't see any long shots or interesting lighting, which I saw in M. The lighting is totally interesting. And I thought the lighting in Scarlet Street was much more creative as well. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you and see if you guys want to correct me.
Well, thanks for your comment, Robert. So Lisa, you are much more versed in Long than myself. Before I turn things over to you to speak to Robert's questions about the visual style of the film, let me also stack your play a little bit higher and bring into the equation a question that we got written into, which is about how this film fits into Long's broader filmography, especially in the way that he treats the theme of justice. So let me turn things over to you, Lisa.
Sure. Robert, thank you for your question. Very good question. I love this question because this is really tying into, as Jacob said, the true joy of actually consuming the entirety of Fritz Lang's career, ideally in chronological order. This is a man who, from his very first films in Weimar era Germany, had such a sense of theme and concept and pursuit and style that really stayed with him throughout the entirety of his career, even in America, with much less power and money in the American studio system than he enjoyed in Europe. But at the same time, as you very astutely mentioned, Robert, that there is an evolution of his style over the multiple decades he was making film. And the one thing that there's a lot that I want to say, but the one thing about the lack, perhaps, of style in The Big Heat, I want to just start off with immediately, is there are some noir stylistics. They're definitely more muted in this. I'm thinking of the hotel room, the penthouse suite of Vince Stone, the heavy shadows in those particular areas, which very thematically connote the darkness of the intentions and the characters in those places. And then that tremendous shot when the handicapped clerk at the auto body shop walks up to actually brave woman, give Banyan some information. That wonderful shot where they're framed with the fencing and the duality of what does that mean for each one of these people. Selma is imprisoned by this crime-ridden society, her disability, anything and everything, and for Banyan it's a whole other. So he's imprisoned by his single-minded fury and vengeance. There are some good shots and some stylistic excess in The Big Heat, but significantly less than even Scarlet Street, almost a decade earlier. Certainly significantly less than M and the height of Lang's more expressionistic German phase. That being said, it's a whole lot of preamble. What I truly love about the direction towards more classicism that Lang is taking with the Big Heat, and even further in the films that follow The Big Heat, is this clarity of direction and cinematography, like this unfussiness in the cinematography that truly lets one of his amazing stylistic choices shine, and that is his use of the dissolve. And I'm sure I talked about this at length in the long courses I taught last year, which I do think are available in the online cinema library, probably.
Sure, thanks, Lisa.
But Long uses dissolves in the big heat to really get at that kind of subliminal, symbolic, abstract space that you're right, is much more, you're right, Robert, is much more manifest in the physical sets or the cinematography in some of his earlier films. But I truly love watching how one scene dissolves into the next in the big heat, because you're really getting at the like dirty or unsettling connections that Lang is making. Let me think of a couple examples. Well, so in the penthouse scene, when Debbie has finally passed away, and as Jacob said, Banyan is still like staring off in the distance, recounting his dead wife. There's this amazing dissolve that brings up the next shot, which is of a newspaper announcing that Lagana and the police commissioner, Higgins, have been indicted. And that dissolve just perfectly pairs the newspaper coming up from the dead horizontal body of Debbie, which just so perfectly, it's like a home run. Justice is served on the the body of dead women in this film, because Banyan doesn't want to get his hands dirty, and he's kind of either consciously or subconsciously using women in this film to do his dirty work in a way. There's probably a lot more I could say about the cinematography aspects, but hopefully that's some helpful context for why, yes, this is a film noir that looks less like a film noir than, say, Scarlet Street, even a decade earlier. Yeah. But there's a shift towards a classicism, not just with Lang, but I think with a lot of film noirs in that 50s period. But then on the other hand, you get something like Kiss Me Deadly, which is like the antithesis of classicism. Let's see, you did have Justice. There we go, Justice. Yeah.
But Nicholas Ray's films, his film noirs seem so much richer because they had all the noir elements, but yet added a whole sense of a city, like there's that one Odd Man Out, like in Ireland, and Third Man, in, I guess that's Vienna, is it?
Yes.
It adds a whole richness. The Nicholas Ray, those two add a richness and dimension that this particular film does not have. That's all.
Well, I think, to your point about all the interiors, how this is shot a lot,
yes,
most of the time in interiors, to me, that's a very apt choice to just kind of show the encroaching constriction of the all pervasive corruption of institutions in the city, of people in the city, of authority in the city, creeping into Banyan himself. So I hear you that there isn't much of a sense of city per se in this film, especially compared to some of the examples you've given. But I think that was a purposeful choice on Lang's part to set it in different interiors. And I think, you mentioned earlier that, Lang is a very architecturally minded director. And yes, that could be, the tremendous buildings in M, where the mob is kind of chasing down Peter Lorre, but it also is the quotidian humdrum space of I shouldn't put it that way, domestic bliss, or the height of the penthouse at the top of the city, this very luxe, opulent, very heavily, adored and curtained and mirrored penthouse of Vince Stone's, or the mansion of Lagana, which Jacob got into earlier. He has this perfect large estate that he wants to keep everything else out. But that's that is again the tension of appearances versus corruption underneath. So I would caution that architecture doesn't necessarily mean a super cool big building with awesome angles like an M, but the architecturally minded nature of Long gets deep into these interiors and the Big Heat, I think, in a really impactful way. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Let's move now to Lorraine. Lorraine, please unmute yourself.
Okay, yes, thanks. You guys have started to touch on the question I'm going to ask, which is just conceptually, how would you say this fits into both Fritz Lang's whole work, like about justice, and then also in film noir? Because I actually was maybe a little bit more optimistic, maybe wrongly, because I thought that at least the police department got a little bit, it was nudged a little bit closer to being, cleaned up, moved in the right direction, even if in a, maybe some unethical ways, Banyan's unethical ways. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Lisa, we're still talking about situating this within Fritz Lang's work, and we can talk about film noir as a genre, cycle, form, etc. as well. Can you start by speaking to the first part of the question about situating this within Lang's oeuvre?
Yeah, justice was a theme throughout Lang's work, like even from the earliest days, but it really started to become, I would say, Lang's maybe number 1 or 2 top concern in thematics and the movies he made around the time that a certain Nazi party was coming to rise in Germany, and he left Europe because his concept of what justice and law meant was so fundamentally opposed to what justice and law now meant in his home country. So justice really became something of a career-long pursuit of exploration for him. But there are no easy answers. Like I think in the Big Heat in particular, violence is so pervasive in this film, and I don't think that Lang would say that violence is completely antithetical to achieving justice. I think that there were wars fought to revert to a sense of justice in the world. Like violence is intrinsic to serving justice, whether we like it or not. But what Lang really toys with in the Big Heat and throughout his career is what constitutes justice for one person over the other, and what the toll of pursuing justice is. And I think Lang is fundamentally suspicious of institutions enacting or achieving justice, but the individual achieving justice is just as fraught and complicated, because of course in Banyan's effort he becomes exactly what he's fighting. So there are no easy answers, but justice is always being considered and prodded and poked in Lang's filmography to really rich ends that we all can continue to chew on long after we've seen the Big Heat.
I'll pick up from here and talk a little bit about the big heat in the context of the film noir cycle. One qualifier that we should say up front about this question, though, which is that film noir as a concept is really a sort of retroactive label. We start to hear critics tossing around the term or trying to qualify or write about the body of work that we call film noir now. We see a little bit of that in the 40s and 50s, contemporaneous with the movement. But the term and the sort of thinking about this body of work as a unified genre is really something that comes to common practice in the 70s. Many of the films that we, would think of as, typical pure film noir now might have been thought of as crime movies or melodramas or what they called women's films, stuff that was, focused on the domestic, things like Mildred Pierce and so forth. That's what people might have called them at the time, gangster films. So I don't know how much Fritz Lang or any other noir practitioner of this sort of first cycle was thinking to themselves, I'm setting out to make a film noir movie. That said, I think we can there's a reason that people group this cycle of films together. We can see continuity, and one must imagine that the directors like Lang working at the time are familiar with the work that's come before and the work that's come after. The Big Heat comes out in the early 50s, which is about a decade into the noir cycle. And one of the interesting things about 50s noir is that, there is a body of work that exists before it. And I think there is space for the directors to riff on the work that's come before. There is a narrative structure in the Big Heat that on paper looks very familiar and very similar to things that would have appeared in, many an earlier gangster film or crime film or film noir. The detective, grappling with taking the law into his own hands or, following the rules of society, grappling between good and evil and ultimately opting for good. And there's an argument to be made. There's a, I think, perfectly valid reading of the film that is more optimistic than perhaps the one that Lisa, you and I have been discussing. I don't even know if Fritz Lang is sort of trying to bring the attitude to the table that, it's all rotten and it's all no good and so forth. But I do think he is, in some ways, picking up on this narrative and complicating it, showing how thorny the pursuit of justice is, showing how once revenge comes into the picture, the moral compass starts to quiver and move in unpredictable directions and spin. The way it's easy to get lost in obsession or to confuse a noble pursuit for, with an obsessive instinct or an obsessive compulsion. So, I think whether or not you come away from the film feeling optimistic or, thinking it's a sort of cynical ending, I do think there is a complication, a gray area that Lang is trying to carve out a little bit here. Did you want to add to that, Lisa?
That was very well said, Jacob. And I guess the only thing I would add is, and I'm sure most, if not everyone, knows this already, but Fritz Lang was not the only European refugee who had these really disillusioned ideas about justice and law. And so, what is constantly being explored in Lang's films of this era, the film noir era, they're definitely being picked up in other expat European film noirs too. So justice as a concept is always fraught in film noir. Well said, Jacob.
Thanks, Lisa. We have still a little bit of time left. We're going to try to get to as many hands as we can. Hopefully we can get to all of you, but we'll see how we do with time. Next, I see we have Matthew Gelfin. Matthew, can you please unmute yourself? Let's hear from you.
Yes, thanks very much. I wanted to highlight the actress Jeanette Nolan, who plays Mrs. Duncan, the wife of the policeman who kills himself at the beginning of the movie. I just thought her acting in this was marvelous. She was just so convincingly evil that I have on my computer screen her publicity photo in the cast listing of the movie. And, a publicity photo is, to make an actor look glamorous and all this. And even looking at that publicity photo, it just gives me the creeps to look at her. She just looks evil in that photo as well. And her acting was really quite subtle. There's one scene, I think, toward the beginning of the film when the Glenn Ford character comes to ask her some questions, and she clearly was putting on a scene of crying about losing her husband, and her acting was so good that she wasn't acting at crying, she was acting at pretending to cry. And all through the movie, she's so manipulative and pretending to be gracious when she's really not, and so forth. And so she just really owned her character so well. And then I looked at her filmography, and lo and behold, it turns out she plays one of the scariest characters in the movies bar none, which is actually one in which she's never on screen. She plays the voice of Mrs. Bates, Norman Bates's mother in Psycho. And I just thought it was how fitting that she was just so good at playing this evil person. And here she is again in another movie later on where she does so well at portraying evil. So I'll leave it at that, and interested to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for bringing up the great Mrs. Duncan in the film, the character who really is the first one we see in action in the film, and I think brings us into it pretty instantly. It's always impressive to see an actor acting at acting within a film. What do you make of her, Lisa?
Thank you for bringing up Bertha. Man, it's this movie is so great for women's roles, because women really do own this movie. Like it's Banyan's show, but women incite the action. Bertha incites this whole scenario, and then Lucy furthers it along by complicating her story, and then of course women resolve it. Bertha is such a great character, and I'm glad that we got some appreciation. Thank you for bringing that up. I do think that, so another one of Lung's favorite themes is taking a real hard look at class, and I think that Bertha being the higher class woman here, certainly it's dirty money, as Debbie alludes to at the end, we're sisters under the mink. I think her class definitely comes into play in Lung's characterization here. However, it is interesting because she is not entirely unsympathetic, because I always remember her little comment about there have been 4 Lucy Chapmans over our relationship, and it's a really interesting undermining of the nuclear family wholesome 50s values. But when you think about how Lieutenant Duncan was actually looking to kind of reform himself after he met Lucy, the B girl, and his wife, in 1953, the wholesome partner of the husband, is very likely, if we're kind of reading in between the lines, the one who is pushing him to keep on, the mob's dole. So because it was revealed that she knew about her husband's activities. So yeah, the character of Bertha is really interesting, but she does play it so viciously. she's so good. And that scene that you bring up of her looking in the mirror, mirrors are everywhere in this movie. I think Matthew was saying earlier that there aren't a lot of heavy symbols maybe or stylistic choices in this. There are mirrors everywhere, and the mirror that she is looking into to kind of compose her acting. I love how Banyan kind of comes in and you see his reflection in the mirror, which just it immediately conjures up this like duplicitous the surfaces of things. Yeah, Bertha is a great character. Evil, but great.
Love Bertha. And a character who is mirrored in the film too. She has her own sister under the mink. Somebody who could very well have walked the same path that she did. We have just a little bit more time. Let's go to David Picker. David, please unmute yourself. What do you have on your mind?
Hi, wow, so much. One of the things that I have a bunch of things to riff off of, but one, obviously, Lang is his attitude toward justice and institutional justice, and institutions of justice, and you see that especially in M, where it's the criminals who ultimately chase down the child murderer, and then at the end, and they want revenge, and then there's his plea for mercy and understanding. I hadn't really gotten that the architecture was not noir, but I did certainly. Nothing in the scenery got in the way of the film, and I think that how tight the film was in a way noir, because it was tense from minute to minute to minute and almost without let up. Two more things. And Lisa mentioned this before, the warmth of Banyan and his wife and their child seemed so genuine to me, and very much not typical 1950s, subservient wife kind of thing. There seemed like a real chemistry there. I love the way she caught the keys when he tossed them to her, and they just seemed to have such an easy relationship. And then, of course, that made what followed that much more traumatic. And finally, and this may seem random or out there, but by the end of the movie, I thought of Banyan as Batman, because he was the person who'd been confronted with a family tragedy, a horrific, violent loss, and goes on a tear, and a vigilante tear, and he's really dancing on the edge of legality and probably dancing over the edge. And he's being criticized as a vigilante and being outside the law, and that was the Batman in the original Detective Comics from the late 1930s.
David,
any comments?
Absolutely. A lot of good stuff there. Thank you for mentioning the really warm, really wonderful scenes between Glenn Ford and Jocelyn Brando, sister of another person named Brando. I think the vigilante question is a very relevant one too. We see him at a certain point leave the badge, take the gun. What better symbol for a person adopting the vigilante path? You mentioned Batman as a reference point. I think it's fair also to consider subsequent vigilante films. I'm thinking of something like Dirty Harry, another cop that plays by his own rules, another cop that, isn't too concerned with how the law dictates that you should solve your crime and the role that violence plays and all that. Maybe even a little bit of Charles Bronson and Death Wish, another vigilante film. In certain ways, this film anticipates them. It may depart from them in other ways too. What do you think, Lisa?
Jacob and I were talking somewhat earlier today. I actually was trying to find the very first version of the Rogue Cop movie, because it is such an entrenched trope in our society today, and yes, vigilante as well. I think vigilante perhaps is a broader topic, and I think the Batman comparison is really spot on. But I really couldn't, in the span of a couple hours, I suppose, when I was poking around, I couldn't come up with the first iteration. I guess prize to whoever does. But this is the Big Heat is, in my estimation, the prototypical version of that. And in fact, William P. McGivern, who wrote the novel The Big Heat, another one of his novels was adapted into a screenplay for a movie called Rogue Cop a couple years later. So he seems to kind of be on the cutting edge of at least the literature, which then filtered into film noir and other films in the 50s. So yeah, it's a really, really early example, if not the earliest example of that trope that is so socially ingrained now. I do have to think that everyone who followed took inspiration from Banyan.
So we have time, I'm afraid, for only one more comment, and then we'll have to close down for the evening. Mike Poteet, Mike, you've got the last word. What's on your mind?
Oh boy, the last word. Well, I just wanted to revisit the last word that Banyan has with Debbie. I appreciate the reading given earlier as it being evidence that maybe he's out of touch with the situation right in front of him. I just can't deny that. But on the other hand, earlier in the film, in that first apartment scene, Debbie had asked him about his wife, and he'd given what she referred to as a police description. And I took that as Banyan's very deliberate refusal to, at that point, to connect with her on an emotional level. So maybe the conversation as Debbie is dying is too little too late. I don't know, but he is at least at that point giving her some of that emotional connection she was seeking earlier. And I wonder how that might complicate our view of him. Thanks.
It's an interesting perspective to bring in. I mean, I think there is, it does seem like there is a limited growth, or Banyan has at least some kind of turn in that moment. We have asked the question, are there things that he's missing? And, this is one that is, I think, open to the eye of the beholder. What do you think, Lisa?
Mike, I appreciate that perspective, and I can simultaneously hold two ideas in my head. And I think both are absolutely valid reasons, because Debbie does ask him again, like, tell me about your wife as she is dying. I read that as Debbie has truly found an arc of her own redemption, and she would ideally like to be remembered by Banyan. This is the unfortunate part, because I don't think this is going to happen. She would like to be remembered by Banyan, in a way that exceeds a police sketch. So I think in her asking him that final time to tell her about his wife, that's in a way her saying, tell me about myself. And if not, a direct one-for-one correlation, tell me that you, Banyan, have the capacity to remember a woman in your life more than her eyes were green. So I think that's my take on why she asks. Beyond, of course, the Hollywood screenwriter, this is what we need to show that Banyan has grown as a human being and reintegrated in society. There's a little bit of that too. Like, this is a very tight movie and things, correlate to each other very nicely. And I do feel like that is tying the bow on Banyan's block, of his emotional block, because all I can think about is revenge. But I do think that Debbie is actually asking it for sadly, self-interested reasons. She would like to be remembered, ideally. The sad part is, though, I don't think that Banyan is really going to think about Debbie. I feel like we have been very negative about Banyan in this conversation, and I feel like there are some very valid readings that could see a more optimistic viewpoint in this movie too. But I am always saddened by that scene, because I do think, as Jacob and I were discussing earlier, I do think that he is going to focus on his wife, which he should, but that he'll never think of Debbie again, really, in a meaningful way. And I think that really is hammered home by that horrible keep the coffee hot phrase we hear at the end. So that's my take.
Thanks for that, Lisa. My friends, I'm afraid to say that we are at the end of our time. Thank you for spending some time with us this evening. It is always so much fun to come together and talk about the movies. We will have another free online film discussion coming up on November 14th. You can expect to learn what the title will be in just a few days. As you can see on the slide, we also have a number of on-site film studies opportunities coming up, including this Thursday, a seminar on the great martial arts film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And next week, none other than Lisa DeNight will be leading a seminar on Billy Wilder's wonderful film, The Apartment. So you can learn more about that and many more upcoming films and offerings at brynmarfilm.org. You can also go to our website to learn about all of our up-to-date new release titles. At the moment, we're still playing Bros, Don't Worry, Darling, The Good House, and See How They Run. And this Friday, we'll be opening Tar, starring Cate Blanchett, which has been getting rave reviews all over. I'm very eager to see it myself. Lastly, let me say that if you like what we do and you haven't yet become a member, please consider joining us. Not only does it support Bryn Mawr Film Institute, but it's a great deal for you that gets you 40%. Yes, that's 40% off of movie tickets, along with discounted tuition to education offerings and much more. And if you have the means and the inclination to make a gift to BMFI, that is also appreciated too, of course. It is your patronage and your support that has kept us alive and strong during the pandemic, during our reopening, and which helps us continue to provide community-oriented programming into the future. So Lisa, let me thank you again for joining us. Always great to hear from you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you to everyone and your awesome comments about one of my favorite films.
Yes, to all you out there, thanks for talking film noir tonight. Looking forward to seeing you next time around.
And thank you so much for what you do for us.
Thank you.